Bibbidi bibbidi bibbidi.
Bibbidi bibbidi.
Bibbidi do.
Hibbidi 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 hoo. Hibbidi hop.
The mouse. I can't hear that rhyme anymore. I'll hear I'll be watching Coco Melon with my kids or something. Not recently, but they'll do Hickory Dickory Dock, and I think of Andrew Dice Clay.
Yeah.
I can't hear certain nursery rhymes.
It.
Yeah.
Yes.
Little Miss Muffet. Do you remember that one?
Maybe.
It was Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and whey, when along came a spider that sat down beside her and said, "Hey, what's in the bowl, bitch?" Oh!
Yes.
The rest I can't broadcast.
Sure.
Good evening, Dustin.
Good evening, Hooper. Good evening, viewer, listener.
Good evening, remote viewer who's
Yes.
seeing this podcast with their minds.
Good evening, guy who's hacked our call here.
Good evening, CIA.
Good evening, government.
Good evening. Should we write a Goodnight Moon that's just good night, everyone who can see us, who we know can see us, who shouldn't be able to see us.
We just tried not to think about it.
Good night, webcam.
You're always on.
Oh, there's a fly. Oh, it's gone. All right. Never mind. I'll try not to do that for the whole show.
Okay.
All right, Dustin.
What's up?
We're somewhere in no man's land July.
Yeah.
So all I can tell you from where we're recording is that it's hot.
Yep.
It's real hot.
Yep.
I went out to get the mail and I was like, woo.
Yep. It's been upwards of 90 degrees here the past couple days, and it's like, whoa, okay.
The heat index the other day was like 115 down here. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
I went running and it was at like 7 o'clock, and it wasn't by that point it's starting to get lower, but it's still sunny, and it was certainly humid. It was gross. You should have seen my shirt.
Oof.
Yeah. It was nasty. Anyways, stay hydrated, everybody, for sure.
Yes.
All right.
Yes, indeed.
Switching gears because there's no transition I can think of at this time. Let's talk about Mass.
Okay.
How many people are coming?
There'll be 4 of them.
Richard, Linda, this is Jay and Gail Perry.
Thank you for agreeing to meet us.
You're welcome.
I'm going to leave you alone. Let me know if you need anything.
You say you want to heal. Is this how?
We're not here to attack you, and we promise that. We want to know how this happened. We need your help with that.
I'm willing to help.
When you talk about blame on your part, I want to know what you're referring to.
It's very hard to answer.
Well, please try.
It's not just one thing.
Tell me about your son.
What would you like to know?
Everything. I want to know everything.
Why?
Why do I want to know about your son? Because he killed mine.
Speaking of sweating, my eyes sweated tears during this film.
Yes. All right. So Dustin and I each watched the film Mass, which is on Hulu right now.
Yes.
This film is written and directed by Fran Kranz. If you don't know who that is, it's because it's his directorial debut, but you may know him as the stoner in Cabin in the Woods. Which as soon as I looked at that, I was like, I would have never made the connection.
Nope,
between
me neither.
This
Not
film
once.
and that guy.
Nope.
So Mass is an interesting movie in that it is super stripped down, very basic film involving 4 characters talking to each other across a table for 2 hours, and that's what's crazy about it. The film stars Reed Bimmy, Ann Dowd, Jason Isaacs, and Martha Plimpton. I probably know Bernie, the stupid, it's doing that thing where it looks like an M. Reed Bernie, who you may know from like House of Cards and The Americans, and there's stuff, but like I didn't recognize him right off the bat.
Sure.
You've got Ann Dowd, who a lot of people know from The Handmaid's Tale, but she's been in a zillion films. Jason Isaacs, people would recognize mostly as Lucius Malfoy or Colonel Tavington from The Patriot, or any number of sons of bitches in movies. And Martha Plimpton, who I most recognize from maybe Raising Hope, but people know her from like The Goonies and and Mosquito Coast, Dustin.
Yes, Mosquito Coast.
Okay. So you got 4 character actors here, basically. And what is happening in this movie is that there has been a tragedy. And Jason Isaacs and Martha Plimpton's son was, I'll say what the tragedy is, because it's kind of hard to talk around it.
It's in the trailer.
Right. Okay. So their son was the victim of a mass shooting at his school, and the perpetrator was the other couple's son, Ann Dowd and Reed Bernie's son. And so they have agreed to meet in this Episcopal church to sort of meet and hopefully get better closure about the situation, because at the time that it happened, there was a lot of nasty legal stuff. Obviously, everybody was very upset. And Jason Isaacs and Martha Plimpton's characters said some, they said some things out of anger to these other couple, and they just kind of want to clear the air and hopefully move on through this conversation.
Yep.
I don't want to say, it's one of those things where you could say a ton about this, but I don't want to take you through the plot anymore, because that's the plot. And the entire film is them speaking and, unpacking this situation and talking about how exactly did this happen? How did you miss the signs that your son was a murderer? And how can we, and how can we move on? I loved this movie. I had only heard about it from one critic, and it just sat on a list for a while for me, and then I finally decided to pull the trigger on it because I don't know.
Choice of words.
Oh God. Oh, I decided to watch the film because it was just time.
Yes.
And so then I recommended it to you. Had you heard of this film before?
I had never heard of this movie.
Really? Okay. Wow. So it was my it was my prompt the other day.
So you recommended it. So I looked up the trailer and I was immediately like, okay, I want to see this movie.
This is a movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think of it?
Yeah, I loved it. I think ultimately gave it 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this film a lot. I'm kind of a sucker anyway for movies where it kind of plays out like a stage play.
Yes.
And so like my mind immediately goes to Alfred Hitchcock and like Dial M for Murder, for instance, which is kind of the same thing. It's like all set in one location and characters enter and exit the scene but it's all there. And it's like a bottle episode, but it's a movie. And that's super intriguing to me, because the fear is always like, okay, well, at an hour and a half or 2 hours, how do you make the same location interesting for that long and block the characters so that it feels real and it's not like an actual stage play where people are cheating towards the audience or
walking up and down stage.
Exactly. And man, they really nailed it here, because I'd say like for the majority of it, maybe it feels like the characters are mostly stationary, like just seated in their at this table, and then eventually they kind of break off and they get some different angles and whatnot, because you have to, but for a big bulk of it, I mean, the characters are just kind of like seated where they are.
Yeah.
And how you make that interesting for that long is only through dialogue. and only through performance. And I mean, clever direction as well. Don't get me wrong, but like the dialogue and performances, that's what sells it. That's what hooks you. And that's what hooked me. And so even though the film is like by and large just people telling stories, so it breaks that screenwriting rule we always learn, show, don't tell. It's like, nope, I'm just going to tell the whole thing.
Right.
So it's a movie of people just telling things. It's super engaging, and I loved it for that.
And I liked the characterization. You start off the bat with like, you know, the Jay and Gail couple getting there first, but like not going in right away. Like you're very much given the emotional context you need, because you don't know as the viewer, if you go into this cold like I did, you don't really exactly understand what they're there for in the beginning. And it's one of those
30 minutes in before you find out.
It's one of those scripts where you're watching the movie and you're like, every single line is important, and it gives you something. Like I couldn't look away from it, because I could just tell like, oh, every facial tick, like every choice in this movie is feeding the story and cluing you into what's going on without being like, as you're aware, our son was the victim of a mass shooting perpetrated by your son. Like it's not doing the exposition thing. It's like, one of the things I wrote here is that the realism, the verisimilitude, the realism is up to 100% in this movie. These people sound like the way people talk to me. It's not like a scripty script. It's not like an Aaron Sorkin script where we're rattling off data perfectly, you know, like, as you know, of the percentage of mass shootings in America, only 35%, you know, like, but everything seeds a story. So I was engaged with the plot and with the unfolding and this through this conversation, and you get more of an understanding of what exactly their relationship was at the time of the incident, and in the immediate aftermath. But
it's such a wise choice as a screenwriter, because like I said, I mean, you've got to make this interesting for 2 hours, and there's very little in terms of like movement and action. So what do? It's a very wise choice to say, well, then we're going to leave the audience in the dark for a half hour. Because I think a lesser film would have done one of two things. It either would have opened with the shooting and we would have seen it happen. Or it would have opened with our characters preparing the room and saying like, now be careful not to bring up anything about this, because you know what they're here for is because one of them is the victim of the, and like it would have spelled the whole thing out before it ever happened. And then yes, we'd still be intrigued, because that's just an intriguing premise, but we'd certainly be less gripped, I think. And so I felt gripped through the whole thing, even though I saw the trailer, and the trailer does spoil what the nature of their relationship is. I was waiting for it to unfold. And so that's where I was able to clock like, oh, it was 30 minutes in, because it was like, at 20 minutes, I'm like, when are they going to like reveal that? You know, like when is that going to happen? And, you know, there it was at 30 minutes in, and it's just a fantastic decision, I thought.
And in the subject matter too, that they're discussing, you know, school shootings and the many angles, the multifaceted nature of victimhood, is a really complex, like if you're just making a movie about a subject, like talk about complicated. Like it's so human. And
emotions are so high around that topic. Yes. And so in that way, like it's timely. I mean, like it's one of those things where it's like, you know, the film came out in January 2021 at Sundance, and it wasn't released in theaters until October. So you think like, wow, like is the message going to be less immediate by the time of the second release? And it's like, hey, don't worry, because we've got plenty of these things that happen. So this is unfortunately an evergreen topic to make a film about, and it's really hard, I think, to make a movie about it or to do anything artistic with this subject matter without coming across as overly simplistic or tasteless or opinionated. And this movie
has the characters briefly, like in 15 seconds, debate the politics of this sort of thing.
Sure.
But the story is 98% focused on the emotional fallout, like the actual, like the stuff that's the human angle of a mass shooting is obviously the loss and grief experienced by anyone who lost anybody in those, but also of the parents of the perpetrator, because in all likelihood, like the nature of mental illness and of these kinds of things is there's not a lot of, they even come across this in the film. Like when someone's decided that they're going to like kill themselves, they look like they're better for a few weeks beforehand because they've made the decision that they're going to do this thing. And so that briefly takes the tension out of their lives. It's messed up. And of course it's even harder than if you're a loved one of that person, because in your mind, it's like, oh, okay. Looks like things are coming up. It's hard to, must be hard to live with. And I'm really impressed that this filmmaker wrote such a good script, found and cast such perfect actors to deliver the lines. And that everything comes together here, the performances and the direction, the editing. For God's sake, I was thinking about the script supervision. I was just thinking about where people were sitting and where their weight was. I was thinking, oh my God, this must have been a nightmare because it's so simple. There's such a small margin for error with blocking. You can't.
I noticed a couple of times where like somebody would put their hand, like their head in their hand, and then it would cut, and it'd be the opposite hand or whatever. A couple times,
sure.
But like everyone likes to nitpick that kind of stuff. Like, oh look, the Joker's thing is on the thing, and I'm like, I don't. You know the one I'm talking about? What was it? It was Two-Face. It was Two-Face. That's what it was. Oh, the Two-Face had his heart monitor thing that's on his hand, on his finger.
His pulse ox.
Yeah, the pulse ox that's on his finger. It keeps appearing and disappearing as the camera moves, because I guess on one day they didn't have it. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Like that kind of stuff. I don't care.
No.
Like who cares? As long as the character's not like in a different wardrobe from shot to shot.
It's just a different actor. It's clearly it's clearly a stand-in.
Right. Yes.
Somebody wouldn't come to set that day.
Right, exactly. What I admire about the film too is, you mentioned the politics of it.
Yeah.
I don't want to say the film doesn't have an angle or doesn't have a perspective or doesn't have a point of view. It certainly does, but it is interested in taking a purely political one, and it isn't interested in taking any kind of position on the psychology of it either. It's more like, to me, and you tell me what you got out of it. What I got out of it was the idea of widening one's view of the situation and accepting other people's perspectives alongside your own was an important thing. And so it wasn't necessarily it wasn't like the film was beating me over the head with, we need gun control or we need to treat mental illness. It wasn't trying to do any of that, although that's brought up because it has to be. But instead, it was just saying, like, just stop and listen to what this other person has to say and what their experience of this was. And in this case, we're going to use two extremes. We're going to use the victim and the perpetrator.
Yeah.
But why don't we listen across the aisle to people who have an alternate perspective and try to find some common ground here and in essence, bring our photographs in and bring these stories to tell and get to know what the other side is thinking. And I think we'll walk away feeling a little more healed than when we came in. And I think that to me was more the point of it. That was more the perspective. It wasn't, again, just trying to, tell you what is right. It was just saying, why don't we listen?
The film is advocating for empathy.
Yes.
It's advocating for empathy among the victims and the victims' families, and it's advocating for empathy before the fact.
Yeah.
The parents were a little bit blind to the factors that contributed to their son's feeling of isolation and loneliness. And so they knew all these things, but they obviously didn't know when he crossed over into wanting to perpetrate violence. And I don't want to give away certain plot points, especially towards the end with Andow's speech, but like the feeling I came away with, like, not only was I just, moved emotionally by the movie, I just sort of came away with a greater empathy towards anyone in that situation. Like, people make mistakes, and in this case, like, parents make mistakes.
And no parent wants to believe their child is capable of that.
And that's the thing. Like, even if there are signs, like, a parent is going to probably be in denial that it's as serious as they might think it is. Well, yeah, my son's a little withdrawn, but like, he would never hurt anybody. Like, oh, well, his friend has guns, but so what? That doesn't mean anything. It's one of those things where I feel like if I'm in that situation, I'm wishing I had talked and checked in with my kids a lot more and made myself more available to them to be able to talk through what they're feeling and get them through it. And I imagine that there's obviously there's a certain amount of guilt that comes with being the parent of someone who does something like that. Like, not only are you sad for, you have this enormous guilt, I would imagine. And she even says, like, you think I don't feel bad? Like, I raised a murderer. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting because, for every one child who's withdrawn and, socially kind of, inept, for lack of a better term. For every child who has issues and maybe has a temper or maybe feels, disassociated, for every child like that commits a crime, there's also there's 10, 100, 1,000 children like that who don't. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very difficult thing. It's easy for an outsider to look at the parents and say, why didn't you recognize these signs? Right. But the thing is, there are a lot of children who have all of those exact same signs and never cross the line into homicide. Right. So how do you truly suss out whether your child or any person that you are in contact with is capable of that? I don't know. Yeah. And that's the thing. And I think that's sort of that's the catch-22 of it. You want to say, well, you should have caught it. Yeah, I should have.
I had.
I wish I had. But how do you do that? You know what I mean? It's a really difficult thing, and you certainly can't. You can't read people's minds, right? So like a performance that a person puts on can be 100% convincing. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, it's tough. One thing that I thought, that I think a lesser film would have done is, like I said, employed flashbacks or employed, that to kind of tug at your heartstrings. Like, let's see these kids, let's see that the day in question. And the other thing that I think a lesser film would have done that this one didn't, that I appreciate, is that I think there would have been a tables turning at some point so that the victims end up somehow also responsible for something. And I don't know that the film ever did that, and I appreciate it for that. The victims are the victims, right? And I think a lesser film would have said something like, "Well, it
goes both ways.
The twist is that your son was bullying my son, you know," and it's like, "Oh, my son brought this on himself," right? That would have been like a twist ending that a lesser film would have done, but it doesn't matter because a child, obviously shouldn't be bullying another child, but a child who doesn't deserve death either. Right. And so a victim is a victim. And I appreciate that.
So like the film is essentially, the point of view characters are Jay and Gail. the victims, the Evan's parents, I think their kid's name is Evan's parents,
Yep.
Evan, who was
Yep.
killed by Hayden, the other couple's kid.
Yep.
So they're our point of view characters. They're the ones that we're kind of with before the conversation begins. And so, yeah, you're kind of, for them, their arc, their journey is to find closure. And, it could have been like if you tried to do it the other way, where you're with Ann Dowd and read Bernie, it would be harder to tell the story through their eyes because their son's the perpetrator. And you, statistically, you as the audience can't identify with what that feels like. Yeah. And so it's easier for you. It's easier window for the audience to identify with the victim's parents because you either have been a victim of this before, or you can obviously, or you've probably thought about what it would be like if that happened to you or your kids.
It's a smart move too, because I mean, if we had started with the other couple's perspective, we maybe could get to the point where we empathize with them and we root for them. Mm-hmm. But the second the victims come in, our heart would immediately go to them.
Right.
Right. So we would leave the person. It makes more sense to start with the victim and immediately we will latch on to them because they're victims.
Yeah.
And then slowly the realization starts that like, hey, these other people aren't bad people.
Yeah.
Right.
And they're suffering too.
Are also victims.
Yeah.
And I think that realization is important. And if you had flipped it, you wouldn't get that realization.
And, Reed Birney's character, like he's clearly a very career focused man. And there's enough there to where you read into like the family dynamic, a little bit. Like Ann Dowd was obviously much more in tune with like how the moving affected Hayden. And the dad was like, well, I mean, like I had to move, like we had to move for my career. Yeah, it's a better house. And she's like, that didn't have a yard. It wasn't outdoors. And he was like, okay, it was a great house though. It was a great neighborhood. And so you read into a little bit of what they've been probably discussing a lot, but you never get the sense that like he's the asshole workaholic 90s dad. You know, he's not like he's smart and he's in tune and he's focused. Like he has answers for everything and not like bullshit answers. Like, no, like I've read about psychopathy. Like we looked at all of this. Like, there were not concrete signs. Even I, the supposedly absent dad, I wasn't really absent. I just was the cause of certain factors in this kid's childhood that you think might have contributed to his becoming a murderer.
Right. Well, yeah, no, I thought initially that he was going to end up being the villain of the piece, and he was going to end up like
making some excuse or something.
Yeah. Or screaming and like, going off and like, I'm leaving. I'm not doing
he opens
whatever.
his shirt and there's just a big swastika on it. It's like,
right. Exactly. Yeah. And you just have that image of like, Martha Plimpton, like, crying and pouring her heart out. And he's like, hold on, my cell phone's ringing. And he pulls out a cell phone. He's like, buy the stocks, buy them all.
I've got to take this. Excuse me.
This is important. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, that was my grand wizard.
For no reason, it's a 1980s car phone. It's like a huge block
like
phone.
The big Wall Street phone.
Yes, exactly. But it's I'm glad they didn't make him the villain of the piece. And again, it works better that we slowly get to realize that he himself is a victim of Hayden's decisions.
Yep.
And he's been tortured by them too. And truth be told, it would have been a really easy scapegoat to say, he's the bad guy. He's the one that made Hayden how he is. And the truth is so much more complicated than that. Real life is more complicated than that. It isn't usually like a dad was absent, so son is a murderer.
Yep. Clear connection.
It's not always that clear. Sometimes it is. Sometimes there's true abuse and post trauma that manifests because of a specific thing. But Most of the time, it's way more complicated.
Yeah, those kinds of simple connections between terrible parents and terrible kids, that's reserved for like a Stephen King novel.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay, clearly this dad's a piece of shit, and that's why his kid's a piece of shit.
Right.
And that's too bad for our protagonist.
Exactly.
And that's fine for what those are.
Sure.
But we've seen it a lot. And it would have dragged this movie down if it had resorted to that. And I'm just so impressed like lately with some of the stuff we've been talking about on the show, like some of these writer directors, like, we always talk about like when we see a really good film that was written and directed by the same person, and that person has made either this is their first film or like their first of 5 films. I'm always like, like as Craig Zell, we talked about Bone Tomahawk. Yeah. And that's one example. And this one, like for Fran Kranz, like this is a remarkable first film, and this would have been a remarkable 12th film. Like, it's not just like, oh, good job, you made a movie, good for you.
Right. It's like, a great movie.
Shit, bro, this is a great film.
If I can point out a couple things about his direction specifically that really, really like impressed me. The first of which, there's so obviously you want to vary up the blocking and the camera placement to allow for things to feel fresh as the conversation goes on.
Yeah.
But also, one of the things that's important in a film like this is making sure that the camera is equal to the performances of the actors in terms of conveying the emotion.
Yeah.
And there's a very specific moment as tensions start to get really high that the camera goes handheld.
Yeah.
And up to that point, it was entirely on sticks.
I noticed that because I was like, oh, he's about to stand up. I could tell he's about to stand up.
Yep. The camera goes handheld for a while leading up to it. It's like, I did not notice when that change happened.
Yeah.
But I certainly noticed that it happened. And then as it builds and builds and builds and builds, it's like, oh yeah, this is the camera telling the story. So imagine watching this on mute. You could still understand, oh yeah, tensions are high here. Not just because the cutting pattern has increased. We're not doing these, longer takes anymore. We're not doing, those wide shots. This is tight. This is close. This is handheld. And it's super impressive that the camera. And again, he wrote the screenplay, so he knows like I've got to convey the tension building here. I'm going to do this with camera as the actors do it with performance. And it's so impressive. There's also the use of this metaphoric image that's repeated through the film of a barbed wire fence with a red like marker on it.
Yeah.
And that to me is I think probably people will interpret that in different ways. However, what that means, right? However, the fact that it exists at all, I think is a really interesting motif. And what I love about it is we initially see this in the opening sequences with Jason Isaacs' character noticing it in the rearview mirror of his car, and he's kind of staring at it, and it's kind of blocked off by his mirror, and then we see it a little bit fuller, and as the film progresses, it's like we're seeing more and more of it. And I don't know if you noticed, halfway through, after the steady cam, after the handheld shots, the aspect ratio of the film changes, and so the aspect ratio gets wider. And the frame literally drops down, becomes narrower. And when it does, that's the first time we're able to see the full like landscape of this, this barbed wire fence with the thing. And it's as if it's now coming into, like fullness, into a clarity, and the image, everything has widened, everything is widening. And to me, it's just a beautiful metaphor that perspectives are now widening. We're starting to see one another, and that, at least that's what I took it to mean, right?
Wow.
That the aspect ratio is becoming wider as as the characters are embracing each other's point of views. And this is, again, just fantastic filmmaking. I don't know if that was intentional. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it certainly lines up with what's happening thematically. And if that is truly the case, it's a phenomenal piece of storytelling and artistic decision making. And so, yeah, my hat's off to you. I mean, he made a great film, and I'll definitely be checking out whatever he does next. I mean, I was super impressed with his direction here and the screenplay.
Totally. I totally agree. Yeah. Mass is great. It's a really good movie.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's on Prime. I mean, I don't know where it's Hulu. God.
Right.
Windwalkers.
Wind takers.
Oh, it's not even. I got it wrong there too. It's Wolfwalkers. Oh my God.
Wolf takers. Wind walkers. Talk winders. Talk wolfers. Wolfer McWolfersons.
Tub thumping. All right. Well, that's Mass. Everyone should watch it. It's really, really great.
That's it.
Goodbye.
I don't want to end it so menacingly. Can I just say bye?
Bye.
Bye, everybody. I recommend the film.
I recommend the film to
How can I say this as least threateningly as possible? You should see this film. It's fantastic.
You sound like good cop, like from like, hey buddy,
hey buddy.
Can you just tell us where they are? I don't believe you.
I don't believe you.
Yippee.